On the evening of March 18, 1314, as the sun bled across the Parisian sky, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, a man whose name once commanded awe and respect, was led to a pyre on a small island in the Seine. His crime? A confession of heresy extracted through 7 years of unimaginable torment. But this wasn't just another execution. It was a meticulously orchestrated symphony of cruelty, a political assassination cloaked in the robes of holy justice. What you're about to hear is not the sanitized version of history you find in textbooks. We will peel back the layers of propaganda and myth to reveal the true horror of Jacques de Molay's final moments, a horror that extends far beyond the searing flames that consumed his body. You will understand the chillingly sophisticated machine of state-sponsored terror that brought down the most powerful military order in Christendom. You will witness the psychological warfare, the legal manipulations, and the calculated cruelty that became a blueprint for future tyrannies. And you will learn why, even today, the curse of Jacques de Molay echoes through the corridors of power, a haunting reminder that some truths, once buried, refuse to stay dead. The story of the Knights Templar begins not in the shadowy dungeons of Paris, but in the sun-scorched landscapes of the Holy Land. For nearly 2 centuries, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, as they were officially known, had been a beacon of Christian might in the East. They were warrior monks, a paradox of piety and pugnacity, their white mantles emblazoned with a stark red cross, a symbol that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies and inspired devotion in the faithful. Founded in 1119 by a small band of 9 French knights, the Templars had a noble mission: to protect Christian pilgrims on their perilous journey to Jerusalem. From these humble beginnings, the order had grown into a transnational corporation of staggering wealth and influence. They were the shock troops of the Crusades, the elite warriors who charged into battle with a fervor that bordered on the suicidal. Their fortresses, scattered across Europe and the Levant, were marvels of military engineering, impregnable bastions that stood as a testament to their power. But the Templars were more than just soldiers. They were also the world's first multinational bankers. Their network of preceptories and commanderies stretched from London to Jerusalem, a financial empire that dwarfed the treasuries of many a king. They invented the concept of the traveler's check, allowing pilgrims to deposit their money in one Templar house and withdraw it in another, a revolutionary innovation in an age of highwaymen and pirates. They managed vast estates, collected rents, and lent money to kings and nobles, becoming the creditors to the very powers that would one day turn on them. By the early 14th century, the Knights Templar were a state within a state. They answered to no king, only to the Pope in Rome. Their Grand Master was a figure of immense prestige, a man who could command armies, negotiate treaties, and influence the course of European politics. They were the guardians of Christendom, the protectors of the faith, and the custodians of a fortune that seemed limitless. Imagine the scene at the Paris Temple, the Order's magnificent headquarters in the heart of the city. A fortress-like complex, it was a bustling hub of activity, a world unto itself. Here, knights trained in the art of war, their swords ringing against shields in the practice yards. Scribes and clerks hunched over ledgers, their quills scratching out the accounts of a global enterprise. And in the great hall, the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, would receive dignitaries and ambassadors, his very presence a symbol of the Order's unshakable power. De Molay himself was a man of his time, a product of the crusading ideal. Born into a noble family in Burgundy around 1243, he had joined the Templars as a young man, dedicating his life to the service of God and the Order. He had fought in the Holy Land, witnessed the last desperate battles for Christian strongholds, and had risen through the ranks to become the 23rd and final Grand Master in 1292. He was a man of action, a soldier at heart, perhaps more comfortable on the battlefield than in the complex world of European diplomacy. He was known for his piety, his courage, and his unwavering loyalty to the Templar cause. But the world was changing. The Crusades were a fading dream, the last Christian outposts in the Holy Land lost. The Templars, once celebrated as heroes, were now seen by some as an anachronism, a wealthy and powerful order with no clear purpose. Their immense wealth, once a source of strength, was now a source of envy and suspicion. And in the shadows, a new kind of power was rising, a power that was far more ruthless and calculating than any Saracen army the Templars had ever faced. King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair for his handsome features, was a monarch of a different breed. Cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless, he was a man who believed in the absolute power of the monarchy. He was a devoutly religious man, at least in his public persona, but his piety was intertwined with a relentless ambition to centralize power in his own hands. He had inherited a kingdom in financial turmoil, his treasury depleted by years of costly wars. He was a king in debt, and his eyes were fixed on the one source of wealth in his kingdom that seemed to have no end: the Knights Templar. Philip was surrounded by a cabal of legal advisors, men like Guillaume de Nogaret, who were masters of propaganda and political manipulation. They were the architects of a new kind of statecraft, one that used the law not as a tool of justice, but as a weapon of power. They understood that in an age of faith, the most effective way to destroy an enemy was to attack their reputation, to brand them as heretics and enemies of God. The king had already demonstrated his willingness to challenge the authority of the Church. In 1303, he had orchestrated the humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII, a man who had dared to assert the supremacy of the papacy over secular rulers. Philip's agents had stormed the papal palace at Anagni, holding the Pope captive and subjecting him to public abuse. The elderly Pope died a month later, his spirit broken. Philip had then engineered the election of a French Pope, Clement V, who was little more than a puppet in his hands, moving the papacy from Rome to Avignon, a city on the border of France, where he could be easily controlled. With the Pope in his pocket, Philip now had the means to attack the Templars. He saw them not as a holy order, but as a rival power, a wealthy and independent organization that stood in the way of his ambitions. Their vast wealth, their international network, and their allegiance to the Pope made them a threat to his vision of a centralized French monarchy. He needed their money, and he would stop at nothing to get it. The plan to destroy the Templars was years in the making, a masterpiece of political intrigue and calculated cruelty. The charges against them were carefully crafted to be as shocking and sensational as possible, designed to horrify medieval sensibilities and make any defense impossible. They were accused of heresy, of denying Christ, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and of engaging in homosexual acts as part of their secret initiation ceremonies. These were the most heinous crimes imaginable in the 14th century, a time when faith was the bedrock of society. The charges were baseless, a litany of lies and fabrications. But Philip and his advisors knew that in the court of public opinion, the truth was often less important than the power of a good story. They understood that by accusing the Templars of such unspeakable acts, they could turn public opinion against them, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that would make their destruction inevitable. The stage was set for one of the most infamous episodes in medieval history, a story of betrayal, torture, and the systematic annihilation of an entire order. The day the Knights Templar fell was a Friday the 13th, a date that has been associated with bad luck ever since. On the morning of October 13, 1307, in a coordinated operation of unprecedented scale and efficiency, Philip's agents struck across France. They moved with a speed and precision that would be impressive even by modern standards, a testament to the meticulous planning that had gone into the operation. Imagine the scene at the Paris temple. Jacques de Molay, the aging Grand Master, had just returned from a meeting with the Pope. He had been lulled into a false sense of security, believing that he had the Pope's support for a new crusade. He had no idea that he was walking into a trap. In the pre-dawn darkness, the royal seneschals and their men, armed with secret arrest warrants, surrounded the temple. They stormed the gates, their torches casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The Templars, caught completely by surprise, were dragged from their beds, their cries of protest silenced by the clatter of steel and the shouts of the king's men. The arrests were swift and brutal. The knights were thrown into chains, their white mantles torn from their backs. They were herded into the dungeons of the temple, the very place where they had once held their secret meetings, now a scene of chaos and despair. The same scene was repeated in Templar houses across France, from the smallest preceptory to the largest commandery. Thousands of knights, sergeants, and chaplains were arrested in a single day, their lives turned upside down in an instant. The shock and confusion among the Templars must have been immense. These were men who had dedicated their lives to the service of God and the Church. They were the elite warriors of Christendom, men who had fought and bled for their faith. And now they were being accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable, their order branded as heretical and their lives in peril. For the people of Paris, the mass arrest of the Templars was a spectacle of epic proportions. They watched in disbelief as the once proud knights were paraded through the streets in chains, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and defiance. Rumors and whispers spread like wildfire through the city, fueled by the sensational charges that were now being publicly proclaimed. The Templars, once celebrated as heroes, were now seen as monsters, their fall from grace a public spectacle for all to see. Philip's propaganda machine was in full swing. He had the charges against the Templars read out in public squares and marketplaces across the kingdom. He enlisted the support of the University of Paris, which issued a declaration condemning the Templars and calling for their punishment. He used the pulpit to spread his message, with priests and bishops denouncing the Templars as enemies of God and the Church. The psychological impact of the mass arrest was devastating. The Templars were isolated from each other, denied access to legal counsel, and subjected to a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. They were told that their fellow knights had already confessed, that their order was doomed, and that their only hope was to confess their own sins and throw themselves on the mercy of the king. It was a strategy designed to break their will, to turn them against each other, and to create a climate of fear and despair that would make the extraction of confessions inevitable. The horror of the Templars' downfall had just begun. The trials of the Knights Templar were a travesty of justice, a macabre theater of cruelty and deception. The charges against them were read out in a litany of horror, each accusation more shocking than the last. But the purpose of the trials was not to seek the truth, but to extract confessions, to create a legal justification for the destruction of the order. And to achieve this goal, Philip and his inquisitors were prepared to use any means necessary, including the most brutal forms of torture. The dungeons of the temple, once a place of prayer and contemplation, were now transformed into chambers of agony. The Templars were subjected to a relentless regime of torture, a systematic campaign of pain and terror designed to break their bodies and their spirits. One of the most common methods of torture was the strappado, a procedure that involved tying the victim's hands behind their back and then hoisting them into the air by their wrists, often with additional weights attached to their feet. The excruciating pain was caused by the dislocation of the shoulder joints and the gradual tearing of ligaments and muscles. Victims were often left hanging for hours, their screams echoing through the stone corridors. Another favored technique was the water torture, known as the question of water. which involved forcing large quantities of water down the victim's throat while they were immobilized on an inclined board. This created the sensation of drowning, a terrifying experience that was designed to break even the most resolute of prisoners. Fire torture was also used, a particularly cruel and agonizing method that was reserved for the most stubborn cases. The victim's feet would be greased with fat and then held over a fire, the flames slowly roasting their flesh. The pain was unbearable, and many Templars confessed to anything their torturers wanted to hear just to make it stop. The psychological torture was just as brutal as the physical. The Templars were kept in dark, cramped cells with minimal food and water. They were denied access to their fellow knights, preventing them from coordinating their responses or supporting each other emotionally. They were subjected to a constant barrage of threats and intimidation, with their interrogators telling them that they would be burned at the stake if they did not confess. The interrogations were designed to be a confusing and disorienting experience. The inquisitors would ask a series of leading questions, twisting the Templars' words and forcing them to admit to crimes they had never committed. The confessions were often vague and contradictory, a testament to the fact that they had been extracted under duress. But for Philip and his advisors, the details were irrelevant. All that mattered was that the Templars confessed, that they admitted their guilt, and that they provided the legal justification for the destruction of their order. One of the most tragic aspects of the trials was the way in which the Templars were turned against each other. The inquisitors would offer leniency to those who confessed and implicated their fellow knights, creating a climate of suspicion and betrayal. Many Templars, broken by torture and despair, confessed to the charges and named their comrades as heretics, hoping to save their own lives. The confessions were then used as evidence against other Templars, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of accusation and confession. The more Templars who confessed, the more credible the charges seemed to be, and the more pressure there was on those who still resisted to do the same. The trials were a masterpiece of propaganda and psychological warfare. They were designed to create a narrative of Templar guilt, a story that would be so compelling and so horrifying that no one would dare to question it. The confessions, extracted through torture and deception, were the centerpiece of this narrative, the irrefutable proof of the Templars' wickedness. And with each new confession, the noose tightened around the neck of the order, their fate sealed by a web of lies and deceit. For 7 long years, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, languished in the dungeons of the Paris temple. He was a man who had once commanded armies, a man who had been a guest at the courts of kings, and now he was a prisoner, his body broken and his spirit teetering on the brink of despair. His ordeal began on that fateful morning of October 13, 1307, when he was arrested along with the other Templars in Paris. He was thrown into a dark, damp cell, his once proud frame now stooped and his eyes clouded with a mixture of confusion and fear. He was subjected to the same brutal forms of torture as his fellow knights. His body stretched on the rack, his feet roasted over a fire, and his lungs filled with water. The physical pain was immense, but it was the psychological torment that was the most difficult to bear. He was isolated from his fellow knights. His only human contact, the grim-faced interrogators who came to his cell each day to demand his confession. They showed him the confessions of his fellow Templars, the names of men he had once trusted now listed as heretics and enemies of the faith. They told him that his order was doomed, that his legacy would be one of shame and infamy, and that his only hope was to confess his own sins and throw himself on the mercy of the king. For a time, de Molay resisted. He was a man of great courage and conviction, a man who had dedicated his life to the service of the Templars. He refused to believe that his order was guilty of the heinous crimes of which it was accused. He held fast to his faith, to his loyalty, and to his belief in the righteousness of the Templar cause. But even the strongest of men have their breaking point. After months of relentless torture and psychological manipulation, de Molay's will began to crumble. He was an old man, his body weakened by years of hardship and his mind clouded by pain and despair. He was faced with an impossible choice: to die a slow and agonizing death, or to confess to crimes he had never committed and save his own life. In the end, he chose to confess. He admitted to the charges of heresy, of denying Christ, and of spitting on the cross. His confession was a devastating blow to the Templar cause, a victory for Philip and his advisors. It was used as evidence against other Templars, and it was proclaimed throughout the kingdom as irrefutable proof of the order's guilt. But de Molay's confession was a lie, a product of torture and despair, and in the years that followed, as he languished in prison, he would come to regret his moment of weakness. He would find a renewed sense of courage and conviction, a determination to defend the honor of his order and to expose the lies of his persecutors. He spent his days in prayer and contemplation, his faith his only solace in the darkness of his cell. He reflected on his life, on the glorious history of the Templars, and on the tragic fate that had befallen them. He knew that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had betrayed his order and his faith, and he resolved to make amends, to use his final moments to set the record straight and to ensure that the truth would one day be known. His opportunity would come on that fateful day in March 1314, when he was brought before a papal commission to hear his final sentence. He knew that he was facing certain death, that there was no hope of escape, but he also knew that he had one last chance to speak the truth, to defy his persecutors, and to reclaim his honor. And as he stood before the commission, his body stooped but his eyes burning with a fierce intensity, he was no longer a broken prisoner, but the defiant Grand Master of the Knights Templar, ready to make his final stand. The day of Jacques de Molay's execution was a spectacle of state-sponsored terror, a carefully orchestrated performance designed to demonstrate the absolute power of the king. The Grand Master, along with 3 of his most senior commanders, was brought before a papal commission on a platform erected in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. A huge crowd had gathered to witness the final act of the Templar drama, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and morbid fascination. The papal cardinals, their red robes a splash of color against the gray Parisian sky, read out the final sentence. The Templars, having confessed to their crimes, were to be condemned to perpetual imprisonment. It was a sentence designed to be both merciful and humiliating, a way of showing the world that the Church was prepared to forgive those who repented of their sins. But Philip and his advisors had underestimated the courage and conviction of Jacques de Molay. As the cardinals finished their pronouncements, the Grand Master, his voice weak but clear, rose to his feet. He had been silent for 7 long years, his only words the forced confessions that had been extracted from him under torture. But now, in his final moments, he would speak the truth. He declared that the Knights Templar were innocent of all the charges against them, that they were a holy and righteous order, and that they had been the victims of a monstrous injustice. He retracted his confession, proclaiming that it had been extracted from him through torture, and that he had only confessed to save his own life. He spoke of his love for the Templar order, of his loyalty to his fellow knights, and of his unwavering faith in God. His words were a bombshell, a direct challenge to the authority of the king and the pope. The crowd, which had been expecting a spectacle of public humiliation, was stunned into silence. The papal cardinals, their faces a mask of shock and disbelief, tried to silence him, but it was too late. The Grand Master's words had been heard, and they would echo through the streets of Paris and beyond. Philip, who was watching the proceedings from a distance, was furious. He had planned this day for years, a public demonstration of his power and a final nail in the coffin of the Templar Order. And now, at the last moment, his carefully crafted narrative had been shattered. He knew that he could not allow de Molay's defiance to go unpunished. He ordered that the Grand Master and his companions be taken to a small island in the Seine, the Isle aux Juifs, and burned at the stake. It was a sentence of unimaginable cruelty, a way of showing the world that no one, not even the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, could defy the will of the king. As the flames licked at his feet, Jacques de Molay, his body stooped but his spirit unbroken, raised his eyes to the heavens, and with his last breath, he uttered a curse, a prophecy of divine retribution that would haunt his persecutors to their graves. He called upon God to judge his enemies, to bring them to justice for their crimes. He summoned King Philip and Pope Clement to appear before the judgment seat of God within a year, to answer for their sins. His words, carried on the wind across the Seine, were a final act of defiance, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming tyranny. The crowd watched in horrified silence as the flames consumed the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, his body turning to ash but his spirit soaring to the heavens. The curse of Jacques de Molay, uttered in his final moments as the flames consumed his body, would become one of the most enduring legends of medieval Europe. Whether it was a prophecy of divine retribution or simply the desperate cry of a dying man, its fulfillment would send shockwaves through the corridors of power. Within a month of de Molay's execution, Pope Clement V, the man who had been a puppet in Philip's hands, was dead. He died in April 1314, reportedly suffering from a painful illness that had plagued him since the beginning of the Templar trials. His death was sudden and unexpected, and many saw it as the first fulfillment of the Grand Master's curse. King Philip IV, the architect of the Templars' destruction, would follow him to the grave just a few months later. He died in November of the same year, killed in a hunting accident that many contemporaries interpreted as divine retribution. The king, who had once seemed so powerful and so invincible, was now just another victim of the curse he had unleashed. The legacy of the Knights Templar would endure long after their destruction. Their story, a tale of piety, power, and betrayal, would be retold and romanticized over the centuries, inspiring countless novels, films, and television shows. The image of the defiant Grand Master, calling down a curse on his enemies as he burned at the stake, would become a powerful symbol of resistance to tyranny. The Templars would also find a new and unexpected form of immortality in the traditions of Freemasonry. In the 18th century, Masonic lodges began to claim a direct descent from the Knights Templar, portraying de Molay as a martyr for the principles of brotherhood, religious tolerance, and resistance to tyranny. While the historical connections between the medieval Templars and modern Freemasons are tenuous at best, the symbolic importance of this claimed lineage has ensured that de Molay's name remains familiar to millions of people who might otherwise never have heard of him. The destruction of the Knights Templar was a turning point in European history, a moment when the old order of warrior monks and crusading ideals gave way to the cold calculations of early modern statecraft. It was a story of cynical political calculation, of legal manipulation, and of the systematic destruction of truth. But it was also a story of extraordinary courage, of a man who, in his final moments, chose to defy his persecutors and to reclaim his honor. The horror of Jacques de Molay's execution lies not just in the physical suffering he endured, but in the sophisticated machine of destruction that made his death possible. It was a horror that was both medieval and modern, a chilling reminder of the enduring power of tyranny and the timeless courage of those who dare to resist it. The story of Jacques de Molay is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a cautionary tale that remains strikingly relevant in our modern world, a world where powerful institutions can still be destroyed by manufactured scandals and forced confessions, where the line between justice and persecution is often perilously thin. The flames that consumed the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar on that small island in the Seine have long since died out. But the echoes of his dying scream, his final curse against his persecutors, can still be heard in the struggles for justice and freedom that continue to this day. His story is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the courage to speak the truth can never be completely extinguished. And as we stand on the banks of the Seine today, looking towards the island where Jacques de Molay burned, we are reminded of the terrible price of unchecked power and the sacred duty of every generation to resist it. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share, and comment below. See you in the next one.